Hello, I'm Jim Rich. I'm the chaplain at Acts Springhouse Estates and glad to be with you for this devotional video for the end of September. We've been working our way through Psalm 34. It's one of a handful of psalms written by David that have a historical inscription preceding it that tells us a little bit about the historical circumstances that prompted David to write that particular psalm. And we've seen before in Psalm 34 that David had to go to the hometown of Goliath in Philistia to get a sword, and you know that he was not anticipating a warm reception because he had killed the hometown hero several years earlier. And in order to get out of the predicament he found himself in, he actually had to feign madness. But after the experience and after his escape, he writes this psalm, and in it he clearly attributes his deliverance to the Lord himself and not to anything clever that David might have thought on his own. We've seen some highlights before, and I'd like to look at some of the highlights in verses 8 through 14 today of Psalm 34. And in verse 8, David says, "O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him." What an astounding statement for David to make given the circumstances that he was under. But he realized that the Lord did, in fact, really deliver him. And as Christians, we know that we have seen that God deals bountifully and bestows his goodness on his people in abundance. And David realized that as well through his supernatural deliverance. But David also wants us to understand that God is not a genie where we can rub the lamp and get unlimited amount of wishes. God's not a free ATM machine where we can go up and put our card in and get money out on somebody else's account. I had a friend in college who referred to his parents as the foundation because when he was short on cash and needed money, he would make a phone call home, and in a day or two he would receive a check, kind of a bequest, from the foundation, and then he was flush with cash. Well, that's not what David is picturing here. Even though God is very good to his people, David has a much different point that he's making here, because when we think about God's kindness to us, his loving kindness, it's not just what we get from God, but what we give to God that is really important. And of course, we know that there's a problem with that because we don't have anything that God needs, but that's okay because he does delight and he welcomes our praises, but even more importantly, he values our obedience, and that's what David is really driving at the last part of the psalm. And if we look at verses 9 and 11, twice David talks about the fear of the Lord really as our response of obedience to God's display of generous loving kindness. And of course, the fear of God is not some cowering or paralyzing terror, but it's a reverential respect for God's holiness and his perfection. It's an awe for who he is and what he does. And of course, we know when we respect someone, even a human, that we tend to treat those folks differently. And that's what David wants us to understand about how we treat God. And the point that comes up here is that God's goodness to us should elicit reverential respect from us. And that's an important point that David is driving home at this point. And as we think about what David has to say to us, we know that as a matter of course, we can't earn God's favor by being good. But because we've already been shown God's favor, that is really our motivation for being good. And that's really what the gospel is all about. So David has the gospel in the Old Testament in kernel form here for us. And as we think about the gospel, and we look at Christ as the ultimate model for obedient thanksgiving, we see that Jesus' entire life was gratitude expressed through obedience to his Father. As a matter of fact, the writer of Hebrews picks up on this very theme, and twice he says, once in chapter 10, verse 7, and also verse 9, the writer of Hebrews applies Psalm 40, verse 8 to Jesus, where Jesus says, "I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart." And so really, for Jesus, an attitude of gratitude is what drove his obedience to the Father. If you're familiar with John Newton, he was the author of the beloved hymn Amazing Grace. He went from a slave trader to a slave of Christ. And he had actually been a sea captain and dealt in slave trading, but the Lord miraculously saved him and delivered him from that debauched life, and he accounted himself his own slave to Jesus. And not only was he thankful for what God had done, as evidenced in the verses of the hymn Amazing Grace, but he did what David is talking about in verse 14. He turned from evil. He left his old life and dedicated himself in repentance to living a life of righteousness and following in obedience to Christ. And so turning from the slave trade and dedicating his life to God and to God's church really was John Newton's way of demonstrating thankfulness, not just with his lips, but with his life as well. And so when we think about it, David in the psalm and John Newton in his hymn, and certainly Jesus in the entirety of his life, all show us what it means to live a life of obedient thanksgiving.